Have you ever really sat and thought about cooties? What a fascinating concept that is that kids come up with without any prompting. Now, I don't know, maybe people don't accuse people of having cooties anymore. I suspect that if you are age roughly 20 or under, that was phased out through force of school policy by the time that you were growing up in elementary school. But I'm guessing for most people sitting in on this conversation, at some point when you were a kid, you accused someone else of having cooties, and you were accused of having cooties. That word sounds offensive. I don't think the word cooties is offensive, but everything's offensive now, and some of it maybe deserves to be, some of it maybe not so much. I'm going with it one way or the other. I don't know what cooties are. I think it meant lice based on the context, but I'm not sure anybody knew what cooties meant as a kid. Maybe germs. I mean, the game went like this. Either somebody who liked you and was in on the joke with you would accuse you of having cooties, and then it was like tag. Nobody wants to get the cooties from you, and cooties are, of course, infectious, so then you chase people down, they get the cooties, and it's like an infection tag game. And there are lots of different versions of this game that everybody played as kids, I'm sure. And then there's the mean version, where somebody only at a very young age. I mean, this quits working by like second or third grade because then it becomes an ironic joke because everybody knows how dumb it is. But at a very young age, like kindergarten, first grade, you might accuse someone else of having cooties to try to get everybody else to be like, ew, and then that person feels sad and left out, which is, that's a bummer. But what an interesting thing that kids have the ability to look at the world, reason to their own notions of clean and unclean, in-group and out-group, and then harness this word that has been dutifully handed down from generation to generation to try to make that happen. And it's also interesting to me that there's no medical training or certification required to level the accusation of cooties against someone else. You can just call it from anywhere. You don't even have to be near them. You don't have to have actually seen any cooties at all. You can just say it, and it's pretty effective. It initiates that ratio of energy that is called the BS asymmetry principle. It takes an order of magnitude more energy to debunk or refute BS than it does to initiate BS. Again, one of these lifelong human practices. And so in a way, the whole cooties thing, it's kind of like the Salem witch trials. It's the old just accuse willy-nilly without any actual meaningful evidence. And then theoretically, the herd mentality out of fear of being accused of being in league with the devil or cooties will then turn on everybody else. There really is an odd Children of the Corn, Lord of the Flies darkness to the cooties thing, or also it can just be a fun game of tag. I don't know. The point is not to talk about cooties. The point is to talk about this notion of clean and unclean and the odd effectiveness of accusing someone else of not being clean. If anybody else comes to their aid and like, I don't know, I think they're clean. Oh, do you, Carl? Well, that sounds exactly like the kind of thing another unclean person might say. And so it should be no surprise whatsoever that when we deal with the topic of clean and unclean, a notion introduced all the way back in the beginning of the Old Testament, that at times we see this illustrate a theological point, one that we'll break down more as we go along here. And at other times, we see this notion of clean and unclean sort of weaponized for the advantage of the in-group and whoever holds the mean girl's plastic sway over the rest of the social order. And that is what we run into here in Matthew chapter 15, in the first couple of verses where a confrontation between the really elite religious leaders who have now made the trip all the way up from Jerusalem to the north where Jesus is hanging out, and Jesus himself and his disciples. So quick refresher, here's the passage. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Now, yesterday we talked about the oral law and this competing, or some would even say complementing, legal tradition that rose up alongside the written law of the Old Testament. We've unpacked some of that before. You've got these Old Testament notions of clean and unclean. The idea that contacting certain stuff, even through no fault of your own, makes you unclean. It doesn't make you morally sinful. It doesn't make you naughty. There is no victim involved. It just makes you unpresentable to the assembly. It makes you unfit to even go to God to offer sacrifices to become clean. So it's like there's a certain degree of cleanness you have to maintain in the Old Testament to even get to a place where you can go and take that uncleanness toward cleanness at the finish line through the mercy of God, accessed through the sacrificial system. You can see how the whole dang thing is just begging for a completion. That whole system is a ... like, oh, just finish it. This is so unsustainable and impossible for humankind. So the clean and unclean thing is spelled out to some extent in Leviticus. We get lists about what animals you can eat and not eat and how to prepare things, and even some stuff about like the female time of the month and stuff involving male sexuality and skin diseases and all kinds of different things like that. And there are prescriptions for what to do to get better and to be presentable as clean once again. Now, obviously, there's a degree of medical efficacy to this. You're taking some unhealthy things and keeping it outside of the camp, outside of the assembly until that stuff clears up. That's a reality we've dealt with a lot over the last year. But like menstruation ain't hurting nobody. So what's the deal with that? That's a much bigger thing for us to break down. But again, it illustrates the point that clean and unclean should not be thought of as naughty and nice, or in a state of being immoral, and that immorality has been unresolved, and now we need to get you to moral. Rather, it seems to be a theological picture of the imperfection of humanity after the calamity in the garden and the introduction of sin into the world, and it seems to illustrate that one way or another, imperfection is on us and is transmissible in a way that it is not on God. God is perfect. He's perfectly clean. He's the definition of clean. We are the definition of not clean. So that concept that the religious elites are coming up from Jerusalem with is entirely biblical. That gets picked up on by Jesus here in just a minute, in a way. Paul talks about that throughout the rest of the New Testament. That is very, very Bible-y. That is very, very true. However, their execution of that is not ordained by God. And wow, you get into the details of what this actual hand washing looked like, and you see it's a pretty ludicrous set of expectations. Well, why did this hand washing need to happen? Because there's a billion different ways that you could get the infectious uncleanness on you. There are some rabbis who even taught that if you walked on dust that Gentiles had walked on and that dust got on you, that then you had uncleanness on you that had to be cleaned off, or else you might inadvertently ingest that uncleanness. So I get what they're going for. I mean, out of sympathy to the Pharisees, remember, the religious fervor of the people had lapsed several times, and under the conditional terms of the Mosaic covenant, where God told Moses, hey, we're going to have a people here. If they obey my law, then everybody's going to know I'm their God and they're my people because I'm going to bless them. If they disobey my law, everybody's still going to know that I'm their God and they're my people because I'm going to punish them. Well, you see a temple get destroyed here or there. You see some enemy occupiers come in and topple your kingdom here or there. You're going to have some people who are going to look to the level of obedience that the people have adhered to or not and be like, we just got to step up our game. We have to make more rules on top of more rules to make sure we don't even accidentally irritate our God. And in doing so, it looks like Jesus, at least, is held out as saying in the text, they fundamentally misunderstand their God and develop something that runs contrary to the nature of God, and that's why they come into conflict with Jesus. So there's a gazillion different ways, through no fault of your own, that one could become unclean. And you can't take the risk of being unclean. One, if somebody else saw that you were unclean, they would call cooties on you, metaphorically, and then you can't go and do all of your temple responsibilities, which is your job and your livelihood. And after a while, and again, I'm sorry to have to cite the COVID example, but I'm going to cite the COVID example. After a while, it becomes unprovable as to who actually got what kind of dust on them, or did you graze an animal you're not supposed to graze while you were in a multicultural market on your way here? Well, the only way to make sure that that hasn't happened is through overwrought protocols and some kind of contact tracing. If you can't see a coronavirus, you put in place a whole bunch of other restrictions to try to figure out how to track it down. Some people might like that game plan, and some people might not like that game plan very much. But if you understand how humanity responded to COVID-19, then you can better understand how this clean and unclean stuff, that to the Pharisees, it was just unimaginable that anybody would do this in any other way. Now, I am not likening the Pharisees to people who like masks or COVID protocols, but in the same way that there's at least 50% of the population during the height of the COVID thing who'd be like, what? You can't go out in bareface. What are you doing? I mean, they even made up a term for that. You can't go out like that. Like, you can't have that kind of interaction with people. You can't sit there. What are you doing? Well, hey, maybe those folks have a great point. My point is not, are they medically right or medically wrong? My point is that the crowd that is going to be in favor of the protocols and the contact tracing is going to be the kind of crowd who are going to be in favor of those things, probably because they want good outcomes and because they can't see a coronavirus. You can't see clean and unclean. You can't see COVID positive and COVID negative. And so instead, people come up with something that is physically in place that you can see. In this case, it's hand washing, and not just any kind of hand washing, but hand washing in a very particular order with a very particular amount of water. This is the cleanliness protocol. This is your travel passport. This is the thing that makes it acceptable and that allows you to pass muster with everybody else whose eyes are on you to say, you don't have the cooties. You are definitely unclean negative. I think that made sense. And so the washing, which had to happen before you ever ate because you wouldn't want to ingest uncleanness, would happen with a prescribed amount of water. And that water had to be applied over the top of one's hands in a certain way. And then it couldn't be allowed to run down the fingers, because then that water, which had become unclean, would run off of your fingers, and then your fingers would touch your mouth while you eat, and you might ingest some non-Jewish uncleanness. So instead, you'd want to tip your hands up, and the proper protocol was to allow that water to drain off of the bottom of your wrists. I'm not kidding. Are you all actually physically doing this right now? I see you, Mike. You're doing this right now. I see you too, Sarah. You did it. You're doing it right there. I saw you. Now you're trying to act like you weren't doing it. You did it with your hands too. It's okay. No judgment. I was also. And really, no judgment for anybody here. I'm not even trying to pick on the Pharisees. I'm trying to explain where they were coming from, because just like last time we had a confrontation between these two parties over something, if we let the people who the text holds out as being wrong come off as insane, then the response of Jesus looks overwrought and unnecessary, and he doesn't look very good. We got to understand both parties and why they're doing what they're doing with a little bit of empathy here, or else we're not going to be in a place where we can make a rational judgment as to which makes more sense. So anyways, if you understand the child psychology behind the game of Cooties, if you understand the much more empathetic adult psychology behind stress over a pandemic or virus and not knowing how to know if people are getting it right and inventing protocols so that you at least have something to look at, whether you agree with all of that or not, whether you like all of that or not, if you can understand the psychology behind it empathetically either way, and then in your brain add an additional hearty dose of religious conviction and fervor, maybe even a dash of superstition, then we're in a place where we can at least start to get the rationale behind what the Pharisees are coming at Jesus with here. Just because we understand it a little better doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're coming at it with the right motives. And whether we understand it or not, Jesus is going to give them a verbal beatdown that is going to be a watershed moment in the entire history of two religions regarding how this whole clean and unclean thing plays out. So stay tuned. All right, I'm tapping out there. Don't get cooties. I'm Matt. This is 10 Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.